There is a particular kind of woman who walks into a room and something in the air simply changes. Nobody announces it. Nobody explains it. But conversations soften slightly, postures straighten without anyone deciding to straighten them, and something that was about to be said carelessly gets reconsidered before it leaves anyone's mouth. She has not raised her voice. She has not made a single demand. And yet everyone in that room already knows, without being told, that she is not someone whose boundaries are available for testing. This is not charisma in the way most people mean the word. It is not beauty, and it is not confidence performed for an audience, the kind that fades the moment the audience leaves. It is something quieter and far more durable, a way of carrying herself, moving through conflict, and holding her own standards that has been built, deliberately or not, over years of refusing to shrink. People do not test her, not because she has ever threatened them, not because she has a reputation that precedes her into every room, but because something in how she exists has already answered the question before anyone thought to ask it. Almost everyone who has spent real time around a woman like this eventually asks themselves the same quiet question. What is it, exactly, that she has that I don't? The honest answer, more often than not, disappoints people looking for a shortcut, because it is not a secret, not a personality trait, not something available only to a fortunate few who were simply raised differently. It is a set of ordinary behaviors, repeated so consistently over so much time that they eventually stopped looking like effort at all, and started looking to everyone watching from the outside, like something she was simply born with. This is available to you, not as a personality transplant, not as some hardened, untouchable version of yourself that feels foreign the moment you try it on and collapses the first time someone you love looks at you with disappointment, but as 5 specific rules behaviors. Really, more than rules that can be practiced starting today. In the smallest and most ordinary moments life happens to offer you. By the end of this, you will know exactly what separates a woman who gets tested constantly from one who almost never is, why the difference has almost nothing to do with personality and almost everything to do with pattern, and precisely where to begin building it in your own life, starting with whatever moment comes next. You may already recognize her, even if you've never quite put language to what makes her different. Perhaps she's a woman you worked alongside years ago, whose calm in the middle of a chaotic meeting somehow reorganized the entire room around her without her ever raising her voice. Perhaps she's someone in your own family, an aunt or a grandmother whose quiet refusal to be rushed, pressured, or guilted into anything became, over decades, its own kind of legend within the family, spoken about with a mixture of admiration and mild unease by relatives who had learned, the hard way, exactly where her lines were. Whoever she is in your memory, the thing you likely remember most clearly is not a single dramatic moment. It's the accumulated impression of someone who simply never needed to perform strength, because the strength itself was never in question. It is worth sitting with that memory for a moment before continuing, because somewhere inside your own history there is very likely a version of her, and the fact that you can picture her at all is the first proof that this is not some foreign, unreachable quality. It is something you have already recognized, admired, and, whether you knew it yet or not, already begun to want for yourself. Before any of the 5 rules, something needs to be said plainly, because without it, everything that follows can be badly misunderstood, and misunderstanding it is the single most common way this entire idea gets ruined for the women who need it most. This has nothing to do with becoming cold, unreachable, or performing a hardness that isn't real. A woman who has simply shut everyone out is not commanding a room. She is protecting herself from one, and those are not the same thing, however similar they might look from a distance, and however tempting it can be, after enough disappointment, to mistake one for the other. What is being described here is not the absence of warmth. It is warmth with a spine underneath it, the capacity to be kind without being available for mistreatment, generous without being taken for granted, soft in her relationships, and utterly immovable on her own worth. There is a reason so few women ever build this, and it has almost nothing to do with lacking the strength for it. Most women are taught, from very early on, that being liked is the objective, and being liked, as a strategy, requires almost constant self-editing, softening opinions before they're fully spoken, apologizing preemptively for things that were never offenses, making yourself smaller in 100 tiny ways so that nobody around you ever has to feel the discomfort of your taking up full space. This training runs deep, and it is rarely undone by a single decision, a single book, or a single powerful video watched late at night when everything finally feels like too much. It is undone the same way it was built, repetition, in small moments, over time, until the new pattern is simply who you are, rather than something you have to remember to perform. Here is what almost nobody tells you plainly. People do not calibrate how they treat you based on how much they like you. They calibrate it based on what your behavior tells them is available to them. A woman who consistently signals that her time, her boundaries, and her self-respect are all negotiable will be treated as though they are, by people who are not even being deliberately unkind. They are simply reading the only information she has given them and acting on it the way any reasonable person acts on the information they're given. And a woman whose behavior consistently signals the opposite will find, often to her own genuine surprise, that people who would never have dreamed of testing her simply never try, because the signal was clear long before any test could begin, and testing an already answered question rarely occurs to anyone. This is the entire secret behind the woman who seems untouchable without ever raising her voice. She is not more naturally intimidating than anyone else. She was not simply born this way, however much it might look that way to someone meeting her for the first time. She has, through 5 specific and learnable behaviors, made herself expensive to disrespect, not through anger, not through threats, not through a carefully cultivated reputation for being difficult, but through a quiet, total consistency that leaves nothing for testing behavior to actually work with. Testing behavior, after all, is not looking for a fight. It is looking for an opening, and a woman who has built these 5 rules into her daily life has simply stopped leaving any. It is also worth saying clearly that none of this is about domination, in the sense the word usually carries control over other people, power exercised at someone else's expense, a hardened persona built to intimidate. The dominance being described here is entirely internal. It is dominance over your own impulse to explain yourself into smallness, dominance over the reflex to absorb disrespect quietly, dominance over the part of you that has spent years believing peace meant swallowing your own standards. What radiates outward from a woman who has built this is not aggression. It is simply the unmistakable, wordless evidence that she answers to herself first, and that evidence, more than any single confrontation ever could, is what makes other people think twice. This shows up differently depending on where in her life it's being tested, and it is worth seeing all of it clearly, because most women build strength in one area of their life while remaining completely untested in another, believing the strength will simply transfer on its own. It rarely does, at least not without deliberate practice in each separate room it needs to live in. A woman might hold firm, effortlessly, with a difficult boss, refusing to be spoken over in a meeting, refusing to accept blame for someone else's failure, and still find herself utterly unable to hold the same firmness with her own mother, reverting instantly to a 15-year-old version of herself the moment a certain tone of voice enters the conversation. Another might be entirely unshakable with her family, having drawn every boundary there years ago, and still find herself explaining, apologizing, and shrinking in a romantic relationship, handing over ground she would never dream of handing over anywhere else. This unevenness is not a contradiction. It is simply evidence of where the old pattern still has the deepest roots, usually in whichever relationship taught it to her first. The workplace test often looks like being interrupted mid-sentence in a meeting, having an idea dismissed only to be praised minutes later when a colleague repeats it, being asked to take on invisible extra labor that nobody else is asked to carry, simply because saying no has always felt riskier than simply absorbing it. The family test often looks like being assigned a role decades ago, the responsible one, the flexible one, the one who doesn't make a fuss, and finding that role nearly impossible to renegotiate, because everyone else in the family has built their own comfort around the old, familiar version of her. The romantic test often looks like the most dangerous version of all, precisely because love makes the old instinct to bend feel, in the moment, like devotion rather than what it actually is. And the friendship test often looks like the quietest of them all, a slow erosion so gradual it can take years to notice, dressed up the entire time as simply being a good and loyal friend. Seeing this clearly matters because it tells you exactly where to aim the 5 rules that follow. You do not need to become a different woman in every room. You need to bring the same woman into every room, deliberately, one setting at a time, starting with whichever one currently costs you the most. Before moving into the 5 rules themselves, one final distinction deserves to be made clearly, because without it, this entire framework risks turning a genuinely useful skill into a source of constant suspicion. Not every disappointment, every awkward comment, every moment of friction is a test. People make honest mistakes. They have bad days, poor timing, blind spots they're genuinely unaware of, and treating every single one of these as a deliberate probe of your boundaries will exhaust you far faster than any actual pattern of disrespect ever could, while also quietly poisoning relationships that never deserved that level of suspicion in the first place. Discernment is what separates the woman who commands real respect from the woman who has simply become defensive toward everyone around her. The 5 rules that follow are built for the pattern, the repeated, deliberate, or habitually careless testing of your limits, not for the ordinary, forgivable friction that exists in every honest relationship, and knowing the difference is itself one of the quietest forms of strength this entire conversation is about. The first rule is this: she never explains a decision to someone who is not entitled to the explanation. This does not mean she is secretive, evasive, or unkind to the people who genuinely matter to her. With those people, she is often generous with context, sometimes more generous than anyone would expect, because trust has earned it and closeness deserves it. But she has drawn a sharp, invisible line between people who deserve her reasoning and people who simply expect it, and she does not confuse the two, ever, regardless of how insistently the second group demands otherwise, regardless of how normal that demand has come to feel over years of meeting it without question. Most women have never drawn this line at all. The habit of justifying every choice, why they said no, why they left early, why they chose one option over another, why they spent their own money the way they chose to spend. It runs so deep that it feels less like a choice and more like breathing, something automatic, something that happens before conscious thought even has a chance to weigh in. But every unnecessary explanation offered to someone who has no real claim to it teaches that person something specific, that your decisions are not fully yours until they've been approved, examined, and found acceptable by someone else's standards. Do this enough times, with enough people, over enough years, and you end up living a life quietly audited by everyone around you, where nothing you choose feels entirely settled until it has survived everyone else's opinion of it. And that is an exhausting way to live, even when nobody around you ever raises their voice about it even once. The woman who has built this rule into her behavior responds differently, and it rarely looks dramatic. Rarely looks like the confrontation people picture when they imagine someone finally standing up for herself. Someone questions why she left the party early. "I had somewhere else to be," is the whole answer, delivered warmly. Without the 6 additional sentences, most people feel compelled to add just to make the departure feel earned. Someone questions a decision that was never actually theirs to weigh in on, a decision about her career, her relationship, her body, her time. She simply doesn't offer the justification at all, redirecting the conversation with the same ease she'd redirect a stranger, asking for directions to a place she's never been. This is not rudeness, and it never lands as rudeness when it's delivered with genuine warmth rather than defensiveness. It is precision, the refusal to spend her explanations on people who were never going to accept them anyway, no matter how thorough or reasonable they were, because the objection was never really about the reasoning in the first place. There is a particular version of this worth naming, because it catches almost every woman at some point. The well-meaning relative, the old friend, the co-worker who has known you long enough to feel entitled to an opinion about choices that were never theirs to weigh in on. These people rarely announce themselves as boundary testers. They frame their questions as concern, their commentary as love, their persistence as simply caring too much to stay quiet. The woman who has built this first rule has learned to receive that framing kindly, without hostility, and still declined to hand over the explanation it was designed to extract. I appreciate you asking, but that's something I've already decided can be said with real warmth in the voice, and it closes the door just as firmly as a harder answer would, without requiring her to become someone she doesn't recognize in order to say it. In a professional setting, this rule takes on a slightly different shape, because the pressure to explain often arrives disguised as due diligence rather than personal curiosity. A manager who questions a completed decision after the fact, not to gather useful information but simply to test whether she'll fold under scrutiny. A colleague who asks why, repeatedly past the point where any real answer would satisfy them, simply to see how long the questioning can continue before she caves and reopens something that was already settled. The woman who has built this rule learns to distinguish, quickly, between a question asked in good faith, which deserves a real answer, and a question asked to erode her decision through sheer repetition, which deserves a calm, unchanging response, repeated exactly as many times as necessary, without escalation, without irritation creeping into her voice, until the questioner simply runs out of road. In a romantic relationship, this rule is tested most often around autonomy, the friendships she keeps, the way she spends an evening alone, the money she earns and how she chooses to spend it, the family she chooses to prioritize on a given holiday. A partner who has learned that enough pressure eventually produces an explanation, and that an explanation eventually produces a concession, will keep applying that pressure indefinitely, because it has always worked before. The shift here rarely requires a confrontation. It requires simply meeting the fourth or fifth, but why, with the same calm, complete answer she gave the first time, without adding anything new to negotiate with, until the questioning either stops entirely or reveals itself as something that was never actually about curiosity in the first place, which is itself valuable information worth having. This first rule extends, too, into the more modern arena of messages and screens, where the pressure to explain often arrives without any of the softening cues. A real conversation would carry no tone of voice, no facial expression, only the bare, sometimes accusatory words themselves, arriving at whatever hour they were sent and expecting an immediate, thorough response. A woman who has built this rule does not owe anyone an instant reply simply because a message has arrived, and she does not owe a paragraph of explanation to a text that only deserved a sentence. She answers when it suits her, as briefly as the situation actually calls for, and she resists the particular urgency that a glowing screen seems to manufacture out of nothing, understanding that the sender's impatience is information about the sender, not an obligation placed on her. The second rule is this: she lets silence do the work that arguing never could. When something is said to provoke her a dismissive comment, a jab disguised as a joke, a question designed to unsettle rather than to learn anything, a remark dropped specifically to see whether it lands, she does not reach for a comeback. She simply looks at it, unbothered, and lets it sit there, unanswered, in the space between them, for exactly as long as it takes for everyone present to feel the shape of that silence. This single behavior does more to unsettle a provocation than any retort ever could, because provocation is built to bounce off resistance. It has nowhere to go against nothing at all, and a provocation with nowhere to go tends to collapse under its own weight, visible to everyone in the room except the person who launched it. This is one of the hardest rules to actually practice, because the instinct to defend yourself the moment you're challenged runs almost as deep as the instinct to explain, and for many women, deeper still. Every fiber of the moment screams that silence will be read as weakness, as agreement, as having nothing to say, as losing. And that fear is exactly what keeps so many women locked into exchanges they never wanted to have in the first place, simply because leaving one unanswered felt unbearable. But a woman who has practiced this rule knows something most people never learn. An unanswered provocation is far more unsettling to the person who made it than any response could ever be, because it denies them the one thing they were actually looking for a reaction to feed on: evidence that the jab landed, permission to keep going. There is a particular quality to this silence worth naming precisely, because it is not the silence of someone who has been stunned into speechlessness, and the difference between the two is visible to anyone paying attention, even if they can't name what they're seeing. It is unhurried, level-eyed, and entirely present, she has heard exactly what was said, understood exactly what it was meant to do, and simply declined to give it what it wanted. Her expression does not tighten defensively. Her shoulders do not rise. She might even let a small, unbothered smile cross her face, the kind that says, without a single word, that she noticed the attempt and found it faintly amusing rather than threatening. This kind of silence, held consistently, becomes one of the most commanding qualities a woman can carry, because it communicates something no argument ever could: that her sense of herself does not require anyone else's agreement to remain fully intact. It is worth distinguishing this from another kind of silence entirely, the cold, punishing silence some people use as a weapon, withdrawing warmth deliberately to make someone suffer for a perceived offense. That is not what is being described here, and confusing the two does real damage to relationships that deserve better. The silence that commands respect is not designed to punish anyone. It is simply the natural result of declining to participate in something beneath the level of the actual relationship. It carries no manipulation inside it, no desire to make the other person squirm. It is, at its core, indifference to the provocation itself, not indifference to the person who offered it, and that distinction, subtle as it sounds, changes everything about how it actually lands. This rule is tested most publicly in group settings, where a comment is often made specifically because an audience is present, and the audience's reaction becomes part of what the provocation is actually reaching for. A backhanded remark at a dinner table, delivered with a laugh so that objecting to it risks making her look unable to take a joke in front of everyone watching. A dismissive comment in a meeting, made just loudly enough for the room to hear, designed to position her as less capable, without ever quite crossing into something she could formally object to. The instinct in these moments is often to perform a defense for the benefit of the audience, to prove, out loud, that the comment didn't land the way it was intended to. The woman who has built this rule resists that instinct entirely. She lets the comment sit in the room, unanswered, and trusts correctly. Almost every time that an audience left to sit with an unanswered jab starts to feel the awkwardness of it themselves, often turning that awkwardness back toward the person who made it rather than toward her. There is a related skill worth naming here: the composed exit from a conversation that has become pointless without ever raising her voice to signal that it has. This might look like a simple, warm, "I think we've covered this," delivered with a genuine smile, followed by a change of subject that nobody in the room feels comfortable resisting, because her calm has already set the new tone for what happens next. Silence and a graceful redirection, used together, do more to end an unproductive exchange than any pointed comeback ever could, because neither one gives the room anything to argue with. The third rule is this: her standards do not bend under pressure, no matter how much emotion is applied against them. This is where so many women lose ground without ever noticing it happening, because the pressure rarely arrives as an obvious attack, rarely announces itself as pressure at all. It arrives as hurt feelings, as guilt gently applied, as the accusation of being cold, difficult, or unreasonable, delivered by someone who has learned, correctly, through years of prior success, that this particular tactic has worked before and is therefore worth deploying again. A standard that holds only until someone gets upset about it was never actually a standard. It was a preference waiting to be negotiated by whoever pushes hardest, disguised as a standard for as long as nobody tested it. The woman who commands respect without demanding it has learned to separate two things that get tangled together in almost everyone: the discomfort of disappointing someone, and the question of whether her standard was actually reasonable in the first place. She allows herself to feel the discomfort. She is not immune to it, and pretending otherwise would be its own kind of dishonesty, a performance of stoicism rather than genuine strength. But she does not let the discomfort make her decisions for her. The plan stays the plan. The boundary stays the boundary. The no stays a no, even when the person hearing it is visibly unhappy about it, even when their unhappiness is genuine rather than manufactured, because she has learned, through practice and through the occasional painful lesson, that a standard is only real if it survives someone's disapproval, and a standard that only exists when it's convenient for everyone was never actually protecting anything. This does not mean she is rigid or unwilling to reconsider anything ever, and it would be a mistake to build a version of this rule that leaves no room for genuine flexibility. Genuine new information changes her mind all the time. She is not stubborn for its own sake, and stubbornness dressed up as principle is its own kind of trap. What doesn't change her mind is pressure alone, unaccompanied by anything new, applied simply because someone is uncomfortable with the answer they were given. She has learned to notice the difference between "you've given me a reason to reconsider" and "you're upset, therefore I should reconsider," and she responds to only one of those, holding the line calmly against the other, without needing to explain the distinction out loud every single time. Consider how this shows up around money, one of the places where standards are tested most relentlessly and most quietly. A friend who consistently expects to be covered, framing every declined offer as stinginess rather than as a reasonable boundary. A family member who treats a loan as a gift the moment repayment becomes inconvenient for them. The woman who holds her standards here does not need to deliver a lecture about financial boundaries every time the subject comes up. She simply, calmly, does not move the line, absorbing whatever discomfort follows without letting that discomfort dictate her actions. And over time, the requests that used to arrive so casually start arriving less often, because the pattern has learned, without ever being told directly, that this particular door does not open under pressure. Family gatherings are one of the most reliable proving grounds for this rule, because they combine emotional pressure with an audience, and both at once make holding a standard considerably harder than it sounds in the abstract. A relative who brings up the same painful subject every single year, at every single gathering, testing whether this will finally be the year she flinches and engages with it the way she always has before. The woman who has built this rule learns to meet the subject with the same brief, unbothered redirection every time. "We're not discussing that today," delivered with a steady voice and an unchanged expression, without escalating into an argument and without disappearing into silence either. Repetition, calmly maintained, eventually teaches even the most persistent relative that this particular avenue has closed, usually faster than years of hoping they would simply understand ever managed to. In salary negotiations and professional requests, this rule shows up as the refusal to accept the first uncomfortable silence or the first pushback as a final answer, while also refusing to let a counterpart's visible frustration talk her out of a number she has already decided is fair. Many women concede in exactly the moment negotiation actually requires standing still, the pause after stating a figure. The moment a counterpart sighs or hesitates, signals almost engineered to produce a quick, nervous retreat. The woman who has built this rule has learned to let that pause sit exactly as long as it needs to, uncomfortable as it feels, because the discomfort belongs to the moment, not to her decision. And it very often resolves in her favor, precisely because she declined to rescue the other person from it. This same standard extends to the body itself, and to rest in ways that rarely get discussed openly but matter just as much as any boundary drawn in a negotiation or a family argument. A woman who has built genuine standards does not need to justify declining a hug she doesn't want, does not need to produce a medical reason for leaving an event early because she's simply reached her limit for the evening, does not need to explain why she's chosen not to drink, not to eat something offered to her, not to stay awake past the hour her own body has asked her to rest. These small, physical boundaries are tested constantly, almost always by people who mean no real harm and would be surprised to learn they were testing anything at all, and holding them calmly, without over-justifying, teaches the people around her, gradually, that her body's preferences do not require anyone's approval to be honored. The fourth rule is this: she walks away calmly from situations that no longer serve her, without needing to win the argument on her way out. This may be the rule most misunderstood by people watching from the outside, because walking away is so often mistaken for losing, for giving up, for admitting defeat, especially by anyone who has spent their life believing that the last word in any exchange determines who actually won it. The woman who has actually mastered this rule knows the opposite is true, that staying in a losing exchange simply to have the last word is its own kind of defeat, one dressed up as victory and mistaken for it by almost everyone involved, including often herself, for years before she finally sees it clearly. There is a particular trap that catches almost everyone at some point. The belief that leaving before the other person concedes anything means they've won, and that belief keeps countless women locked in exhausting, circular arguments long after any real exchange of ideas has stopped happening. Long after the conversation has become nothing more than two people repeating themselves at increasing volume in the hope that repetition alone will eventually produce agreement. But some conversations were never actually contests to be won. They were simply drains, and the longer you remain inside one, the more of yourself you spend for absolutely nothing in return. No resolution, no understanding, nothing but exhaustion, and the same disagreement you started with, now with more resentment attached to it. Recognizing that moment, the exact point where a conversation has stopped being useful and started being self-abandonment, and choosing calmly to leave it, is one of the purest expressions of self-command there is. This rule extends far beyond single arguments, and this is where it becomes truly powerful rather than merely useful in isolated moments. It applies to relationships that have quietly stopped growing, to jobs that have stopped valuing what she brings to them despite years of loyalty that was never reciprocated in kind, to friendships that survive only on her continued willingness to overlook what's actually happening inside them, absorbing slight after slight in the name of history that no longer justifies the cost. The woman who commands respect does not need to announce her exit with a speech explaining every reason behind it, does not need the other party's understanding or agreement to make the decision final. She simply, calmly redirects her time and her presence elsewhere, trusting that her worth does not require anyone's permission, understanding, or agreement to remain exactly as intact as it already was. There is a specific kind of grief that accompanies this rule, worth naming honestly rather than glossing over, because pretending walking away is always easy does a disservice to anyone actually trying to practice it. Leaving something, a relationship, a role, a version of your own life you had built real history inside costs something, even when leaving is clearly the right choice. The woman who walks away well does not pretend this cost doesn't exist. She simply refuses to let the cost keep her somewhere that has already shown her repeatedly that it will not change. Grief and resolve are allowed to exist in the very same body, at the very same time, and holding both at once, without letting the grief undo the resolve, is itself a form of quiet strength that rarely gets the credit it deserves. In a career, this rule often reveals itself over years, rather than in a single moment of promotion promised repeatedly and never delivered, a role that quietly absorbed more and more responsibility, without any corresponding change in title, pay, or respect. The woman who has built this rule does not need to stage a dramatic resignation, does not need to deliver a farewell speech cataloging every grievance on her way out the door. She simply begins, quietly and deliberately, updating her resume, taking the interview, accepting the offer that finally matches what she's actually worth, and walking out with the same composure she walked in with years earlier, offering no more explanation to the people who failed to value her than professional courtesy requires. In a romantic relationship that has run its course, this rule is tested most severely, because leaving here rarely feels clean, and the temptation to stay just long enough to be fully understood, fully validated, fully agreed with about who was right and who was wrong, can stretch what should have been a clear decision into months or years of painful limbo. The woman who has built this rule learns to recognize when a relationship has stopped being a partnership and become, instead, a slow negotiation over how much of herself she's willing to keep losing. She does not need the other person's agreement that the relationship is over in order for it to actually be over. She simply, calmly, begins living as though it already is, and lets her own composure, not a final argument, not one last attempt to be understood, be the thing that closes it. Friendship is, in many ways, the quietest place this rule ever gets tested, precisely because there is rarely a clear ending point to notice, no wedding to call off, no lease to break, no single event that marks the moment things changed. A friendship that has stopped being reciprocal tends to fade so gradually that both people can go on calling each other close for years after the balance has actually tipped, one side consistently reaching out, remembering, showing up, while the other side consistently receives all of it without ever quite matching the effort. The woman who has built this rule does not need a dramatic falling out to address this imbalance. She simply, quietly, stops initiating as often, redirects the energy she used to pour into a one-sided connection toward relationships that return it, and lets the friendship find its own natural, honest level, sometimes settling into something smaller and more occasional, sometimes fading out entirely, without a single accusation ever needing to be made out loud. The fifth rule is this: she treats herself with the same seriousness in private that she projects in public. This is the rule that makes all the others possible. Because a woman whose composure only exists in front of an audience has not actually built anything, she has only learned to perform it. And performances collapse the moment nobody is watching, or the moment the pressure gets high enough to strip the performance away entirely, revealing whatever was actually underneath it the whole time. The woman nobody dares to test keeps her word to herself as seriously as she keeps it to anyone else. The commitment made alone, with no witness and no applause coming, gets honored the same way a promise to someone important would be honored the early morning she promised herself, the boundary around her own evenings that she set, with nobody there to enforce it but her, the standard of how she speaks to herself internally when something goes wrong, held to the same discipline she would apply if someone else were listening. This is where quiet strength is actually built. Not in the dramatic confrontation everyone imagines when they picture standing up for yourself, but in the thousand small, unwitnessed moments where she chose to take herself seriously when it would have been so much easier and so much less visible to anyone not to. There is a specific practice worth naming here, because it is one of the most concrete ways this fifth rule actually shows up, the way she speaks to herself after a mistake. Most people, in the privacy of their own minds, say things to themselves after an error that they would never say out loud to someone they respected, words far harsher, far more contemptuous than anything a stranger would ever be permitted to say to them. This internal contempt does real damage over time, quietly eroding the very foundation the other four rules are supposed to stand on, because it is very difficult to hold external standards with any real conviction, while treating yourself internally with none at all. The woman who has built this fifth rule has learned to correct herself the way a good mentor corrects someone they believe in directly, honestly, without cruelty, because she understands that the way she treats herself in solitude eventually becomes the way she allows others to treat her in public, whether she intends that transfer or not. This fifth rule also shows up in something far less dramatic than any confrontation, the ordinary discipline of solitude itself. The woman who has built this rule is comfortable being alone with her own thoughts, capable of spending an evening in her own company without reaching immediately for distraction to escape the quiet. This matters more than it might seem, because a woman who cannot tolerate her own solitude will often, without realizing it, tolerate far more disrespect than she should in order to avoid being left with only herself, mistaking uncomfortable company for better company simply because it isn't silence. Building comfort with solitude, an evening spent reading instead of scrolling for company, a weekend spent entirely on her own terms without needing it filled by someone else's plans, quietly removes one of the most common reasons people stay in situations that were never actually serving them. There is also a version of this rule that shows up in how she keeps her own physical space and her own routines, small as it sounds. The bed made in the morning even though no one will see it. The meal eaten sitting down, with real attention, rather than standing over a counter because she didn't feel she was worth the extra 10 minutes. These are not aesthetic preferences. They are votes cast, privately, for the idea that her own comfort and her own care matter, even when nobody is there to witness them, and a woman who casts that vote consistently, in private, rarely needs to fight for the same regard in public. She simply already carries it with her, visible in her posture and her presence, long before she says a single word. There is a final effect of these 5 rules worth naming, one that rarely gets discussed but tends to matter enormously to the women who experience it. This quiet consistency does not only change how she is treated, it changes what becomes possible for the people who love her. Daughters raised alongside a mother who holds these 5 rules absorb, without ever being formally taught, that explanations are not owed to everyone who demands them, that silence is not weakness, that standards are allowed to survive someone else's disappointment. Friends who spend real time around a woman who has built this often find their own boundaries strengthening simply through proximity. The way posture improves in the company of someone who never slouches. None of this is the goal. Exactly the goal is her own peace, her own dignity, her own undisturbed sense of self, but it is worth knowing that the effect of building it rarely stays contained to her alone. It's also worth understanding why these 5 rules work far better together than any single one of them works alone, because women who attempt only one, usually the silence, since it looks the most immediately impressive from the outside, often find it hollow without the others underneath it. Silence without solid standards underneath it can curdle into avoidance, a way of not dealing with something rather than a genuine act of composure. Walking away without the discipline of the 5th rule underneath. It can become a pattern of fleeing every difficulty rather than a deliberate, considered choice about which battles are actually worth fighting. The 5 rules function as a single structure, each one reinforcing the others and building them together, even slowly and imperfectly, produces something far more stable than mastering any one of them in isolation ever could. Building these 5 rules into your actual behavior, rather than simply understanding them intellectually, takes deliberate practice, because the old patterns over-explaining, absorbing provocation, softening under pressure, staying too long, and treating your own commitments as optional are usually decades in the making, reinforced by thousands of small repetitions, long before you ever had the language to notice what was happening. Real change here happens in layers, not all at once, and it is worth being genuinely patient with yourself while you build it, because impatience with your own progress is, ironically, just another version of the same harsh internal voice. The 5th rule is asking you to soften. Begin with the 1st rule, because it is the easiest to practice immediately and the fastest to show results. And early wins matter enormously when you're building something this unfamiliar. For 1 week, notice every explanation you offer that nobody actually earned. Keep a running count if it helps make the pattern visible. Most women are startled by how high that number climbs once they actually start paying attention to it. Notice how often no turns into 3 sentences of justification before it turns into no. Practice letting the shorter, cleaner answer stand on its own, even when the silence that follows it feels uncomfortable, even when every instinct tells you to fill it. That discomfort fades with repetition, faster than most people expect, usually within a matter of days rather than weeks. Move next into practicing silence deliberately, in low-stakes situations first, before you ever need it in a high-stakes one, because silence, like any other skill, is far easier to build under small pressure than to attempt for the first time in the middle of something that actually matters to you. The next time someone says something mildly provoking, nothing serious, just a small jab or an unnecessary comment at a family dinner, a mildly dismissive remark from a coworker, practice simply not filling the silence that follows. Let it sit. Count to 5 in your head if it helps anchor you through the discomfort. Notice how much more room it takes up than words would have, and notice, too, how much less it costs you to hold it than you expected, and how the other person, more often than not, ends up filling the space themselves, often walking back what they said without you ever having to ask them to. Then turn to your standards, and pick one you have been quietly letting slide under pressure, a boundary around your time, your energy, or your money that tends to bend the moment someone expresses disappointment about it. Hold it once, deliberately, the next time it's tested, and pay close attention to what actually happens afterward, writing it down that same night if you can. while the memory is fresh. Almost always, the consequence you feared is smaller than the cost of continuing to let the standard bend indefinitely, and seeing that gap in writing, in your own words, tends to make the next attempt considerably easier than the first one was. After that, practice the fourth rule in its smallest possible form before attempting it anywhere large. Leave one low-stakes conversation before it has fully resolved a disagreement with a stranger online, a minor dispute that genuinely does not matter, simply to build the muscle of walking away without needing the last word. This might feel almost silly in its smallness, but the muscle built in small, low-consequence moments is exactly the muscle you will need the day. A much larger conversation calls for the same response, and it is far better to have practiced before that day arrives than to attempt the skill for the first time when the stakes are highest. Finally, look honestly at how you speak to yourself the next time you make a mistake, however minor. Notice the tone your mind reaches for automatically. Notice whether it is a tone you would ever permit someone else to use toward you out loud. If it isn't, practice interrupting it deliberately, replacing it with the tone you would use toward someone you respected who had made the exact same mistake. This single practice, repeated consistently, does more to build the foundation beneath the other four rules than almost anything else on this list, because it addresses the quiet, private relationship everything else is actually built on top of. Alongside these five, it helps enormously to pick a single relationship or setting where the old pattern runs deepest, the one you identified earlier, whichever room costs you the most, and apply all five rules there specifically, rather than trying to change everything everywhere at once. Broad, unfocused effort tends to dissolve into nothing after a week or two, while concentrated effort in one specific relationship produces visible results fast enough to keep you motivated for the harder work of extending it elsewhere. If the deepest pattern lives with a parent, practice there first. If it lives at work, begin there. Let the confidence built in that one place become the evidence you carry into every other room afterward. It also helps to notice, and even to keep a private record of, every moment where one of these five rules produces a result different from what the old pattern would have produced. The explanation you didn't give and nothing bad happened. The silence you held and the provocation lost its air. The boundary you kept and the relationship survived intact, or revealed itself as never having been worth keeping in the first place. This record becomes its own quiet proof, over time, more convincing than any external reassurance could be, because it is built entirely from your own direct experience rather than from anyone else's promise that things would get easier. Expect setbacks and plan for them in advance rather than treating them as evidence that this doesn't work for you. There will be a day when the old explanation comes rushing out before you can stop it, a provocation that gets an answer instead of silence, a boundary that bends because the pressure arrived at the exact moment you had the least capacity to hold it. This is not failure. It is simply what practicing any deeply ingrained change actually looks like, and the only real mistake available to you here is deciding that one slip proves the whole effort was pointless. The woman who eventually builds all five rules into who she is was never the woman who never slipped. She was simply the woman who returned to the practice the very next opportunity, without spending days punishing herself for the one that got away. There is real cost to never building any of this, and it rarely shows up as one dramatic moment, one clear before and after that makes the loss obvious even in hindsight. It shows up instead as a slow erosion, years spent explaining yourself to people who were never going to be satisfied no matter how thoroughly you explained, years spent absorbing provocations that left a small residue behind each time, accumulating quietly until the residue became something closer to a permanent weight. Years spent bending standards under pressure until the standards themselves became difficult to remember clearly, buried under so many exceptions that the original line had long since disappeared. The woman who never builds these 5 rules does not usually notice the cost all at once. She notices it gradually, in the quiet realization, often arriving somewhere in her 40s or 50s. That she has spent an enormous amount of her life auditioning for respect that was never going to be freely given to a version of her that kept making herself easy to overlook. There is a particular moment many women describe when they finally do notice this cost clearly, and it rarely arrives during an argument or a crisis. It arrives, more often, in an ordinary quiet moment driving home from a gathering, lying awake after an unremarkable evening when some small comment from earlier in the day suddenly replays itself, and instead of the usual instinct to excuse it, something different happens. A flicker of recognition that this has happened before, many times, in almost exactly this shape, and that she has never once let herself add up the total. That flicker, uncomfortable as it is often the actual beginning of everything that follows, far more than any single decision to change ever is. It is simply the moment the pattern finally became visible enough to name. There was a woman who spent most of her 30s being described, by everyone who knew her, as endlessly accommodating the one who could be counted on to bend, to explain, to smooth things over, to make herself smaller so that nobody around her ever had to feel the discomfort of her taking up full space. She was well liked. She was also, quietly, exhausted in a way she had stopped being able to name, because being well liked and being respected had, somewhere along the way, become 2 entirely different things, and she had only ever been given the first one, mistaking it for years for something closer to the second. The shift did not begin with a single dramatic event, and it is worth being honest about that, because so many women wait for a dramatic event to justify the change, and the wait can consume years that were never necessary to lose. It began with a small, almost unremarkable decision to stop explaining a choice that a colleague had questioned, a choice that was entirely hers to make and had cost that colleague nothing at all. She simply said, "That's what I've decided," and let the silence that followed sit there, uncomfortable, without rushing to fill it with justification. The colleague was visibly surprised. Nothing happened. The world did not end. No friendship was lost, no reputation damaged. And something small but permanent shifted inside her proof, however minor, that her decisions could stand without needing anyone else's approval attached to them. She practiced this deliberately, in small moments, for the better part of a year. She let silence answer provocations that used to earn a defensive reply, watching, each time, as the provocation seemed to shrink in the space where a reaction used to be. She held a boundary around her weekends that she had let bend for a decade, and weathered the mild disappointment that followed the first few times without collapsing under it, noticing, gradually, that the disappointment always faded faster than her old fear had predicted it would. She left a friendship that had quietly stopped being reciprocal, not with a speech, but with a gradual, calm redirection of her time toward people who had actually earned it, and she began, finally, to speak to herself in the aftermath of her own mistakes, with something closer to the patience she had always so easily extended to everyone else. None of it happened quickly, all of it happened steadily. And by the end of that year, something had changed in how people treated her that she had not directly asked for and had not needed to announce. The small tests had simply stopped arriving, because her behavior had stopped giving them anywhere to land. Colleagues who used to push back reflexively on her decisions started accepting them without comment. A relative who had spent years making careless remarks at family gatherings began, without ever being confronted about it directly, choosing his words differently around her. Nothing about this required a single dramatic confrontation. It required only the steady, patient accumulation of 5 ordinary behaviors, repeated in small moments, until they had quietly rewritten every piece of information everyone around her had ever gathered about what she would allow. There was another woman, younger than the first, who came to these 5 rules from an entirely different starting point, not from a lifetime of quiet accommodation, but from the aftermath of a single relationship that had taught her, over 3 difficult years, exactly how far someone could push before she finally, painfully, drew a line. She had spent those years explaining herself constantly, absorbing comment after comment about her friendships, her family, her choices, telling herself each time that this was simply what compromise looked like, that every relationship required this much bending, that she was the difficult one for even noticing how much she'd given up. By the time the relationship ended, she barely recognized the version of herself in old photographs. Someone who used to laugh more loudly, take up more space, hold opinions without immediately softening them the moment anyone frowned. The rebuilding did not happen through some singular moment of clarity, however satisfying that would be to describe. It happened through the same 5 rules, practiced deliberately, in a life that finally belonged only to her. She began with the first rule, refusing to explain a new decision to a well-meaning friend who questioned why she'd chosen to spend a Saturday entirely alone rather than joining a group outing. And she noticed, with something like surprise, how much lighter the refusal felt than the explanation would have. She practiced the second rule at a family dinner, letting an uncle's careless comment about her being too picky now sit in the air, unanswered, watching him fill the silence himself with an awkward joke that walked the comment back without her having said a single word. She held the third rule around her time, declining a request to help plan an event she had no real stake in, absorbing the brief flash of guilt without letting it change her answer. She practiced the fourth rule by ending a phone call with a friend who had spent 20 minutes relitigating an old argument. Neither of them could win, calmly, without anger, simply saying she needed to go. And she practiced the fifth rule every single morning, in the quiet 10 minutes before anyone else was awake, treating that time as sacred regardless of whether anyone else in her life would ever know it existed. 2 years later, she described the change not as becoming a different person, but as becoming, finally, unmistakably, the same person in every room she walked into, no longer one version of herself with her family, another with her friends, and a smaller, more careful version with anyone she was dating. The consistency itself, she said, was what people responded to long before they could have named what exactly had changed about her. It was never one rule that did it. It was all 5, held together, repeated in ordinary moments, until they stopped being something she was practicing and simply became who she was. What both of these women eventually discovered, from very different starting points, is something worth naming plainly. Once these 5 rules become genuinely consistent rather than something performed under pressure, the testing itself starts to happen far less often. In every new relationship, from the very first encounter, before there has ever been a history to draw on. A new colleague meeting her for the first time reads the composure in how she carries a disagreement and simply calibrates accordingly, without ever needing to test the boundary personally to find out where it sits. A new acquaintance senses, within the first few interactions, that careless comments will not be met with an anxious explanation or a flustered response, and adjusts their own behavior before it ever becomes an issue worth having a conversation about. This is, in the end, the real reward hiding underneath all 5 rules, not merely surviving the tests that come, but very often preventing most of them from ever being attempted in the first place, simply because there was never any opening for them to begin with. There is one more thing worth saying before this closes, because without it, the 5 rules can start to feel like armor rather than what they actually are. None of this is about becoming untouchable in the sense of becoming unreachable, unemotional, or immune to being hurt. The woman who has genuinely built these 5 rules is not numb. She still feels disappointment, still grieves what she loses when she walks away from something that mattered, still notices the sting of a comment even when she chooses not to answer it out loud. The difference is not that she has stopped feeling any of it. The difference is that she no longer lets what she feels override what she knows to be true about her own worth, and that distinction, feeling fully while still holding the line, is the actual, quiet dominance this entire conversation has been pointing toward all along. Today, before this day ends, choose one of these 5 rules and practice it once, in whatever small moment presents itself, without waiting for the perfect, high-stakes occasion to attempt it for the first time. Let one decision stand without an explanation trailing behind it. Let one provocation go unanswered, calmly, without reaching for a comeback. Hold one boundary you have been letting slide, just this once, and notice what actually happens when you do. Leave one conversation before it demands more of you than it deserves. Or simply notice, tonight, the tone you use with yourself, and choose, deliberately, to soften it into something you would actually be proud to say out loud. None of this requires you to become someone unrecognizable to yourself, and none of it requires anyone else's permission to begin. It does not require an audience to witness it, a relationship to end dramatically, or a single perfect sentence delivered at exactly the right moment to prove that something has changed. It only requires the next small moment, and the willingness to meet it a little differently than you have before, and then the moment after that, and the one after that, until one day, without ever having announced it to anyone, you notice that the tests have simply stopped arriving, because there is finally nothing left in how you carry yourself for them to find. There is no finish line here, no single point at which this work becomes complete and can be set aside. The 5 rules are not a destination you eventually arrive at and stay in permanently, immune from ever needing to practice them again. They are closer to a discipline, something returned to daily, in small moments, for the rest of a life, the way composure is rebuilt each morning, rather than earned once and kept forever. Some days it will come easily, almost without thought. Other days, particularly difficult ones, it will feel like starting over entirely. Both are part of the same ongoing practice, and neither one means anything has gone wrong. What matters is simply returning to it, again and again, in whatever small moment presents itself next.